All right, and welcome everybody to the B&H virtual event space. Right now we have Sony Artisan of Imagery, Tony Gale, back with us again to talk about some of the things to consider when deciding on buying a new camera and lens. Big thank you to Sony for sponsoring this webinar. So without further ado, Tony, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Danny. Hi, everybody. I'm sure some of you have seen me speak before, and for those of you who haven't, I am Tony Gale. I am a Sony Artisan of Imagery, and today I'm going to be going over what camera and lens should I buy, or you buy. I know what ones I should buy. Part of the idea for doing this is I often see on some of the photo Facebook groups, people say, what camera should I buy? What lens should I buy? There's a lot that goes into that, so hopefully we can go over enough of that you have some sense of it. In addition to being a Sony Artisan of Imagery, and again, thank you to Sony for sponsoring this. I wouldn't be here if not for them. I am also a Manfrotto Ambassador, X-Rite Colorati, and APA National President. I am primarily a commercial portrait editorial advertising photographer. This was me when I first started 1996-ish with longer hair. All right, what camera and lens should I buy? So it depends. There is no easy answer. It just depends. But there's so much awesome stuff out there. That picture of me from a moment ago was done with a camera that could do 3 whole frames a second. It took film, at most you could get 36 frames on one roll. Now with digital, you can do 30 frames a second with an Alpha 1. You can put a big card in there and get thousands of pictures. Autofocus is better. The resolution is better. When COVID started, I scanned a bunch of film that's just been sitting there forever, because sort of if I don't scan it, it doesn't exist. It's just in a box. And realized, or was reminded, that my modern Sony cameras are so much better than 35mm film was in terms of the resolution and the image quality. If you love film, you love film, totally cool. But in terms of sharpness and all of that, modern digital just blows it away. There's a million choices. This is every Sony mirrorless camera that's currently on the B&H website. So there's 14 of them, although 2 of them are variations on the same model. There are, I believe, 63 Sony E-mount lenses. There's a ton. So there's a lot of choices. And of course, I recognize I prefer Sony. I do honestly think Sony is the best choice for a lot of people. You may not be that person. For some people, some other camera is the right choice. That's fine. I firmly believe that we need competition in several robust camera brands to drive innovation. I'm going to be focusing on Sony, obviously, because that's what I know. And as we talk about things, hopefully, if for whatever reason you don't think Sony is the right choice for you, hopefully it will still be helpful. We still like you. No matter what camera you buy, you're still a photographer. All right, so the first question when trying to decide what camera and lens should you buy is, what kind of photos do you want to take? Do you want to shoot sports, portraits, street photography, travel photography, architecture, animals, events, a little bit of everything? There's also, a million other specialties. I didn't include still life. But there's a lot of choices. And the first question is, what do you want to take pictures of? If you're just starting out, you probably want to take pictures of everything. And I think everybody to a certain extent does. When I started out and I was told to be a professional photographer, you should really specialize, which is sort of true and sort of not, depending on where you live. We did a 3-part series on the business of photography. And if you go back and watch that on the B&H channels, I talk about that. But I didn't want to specialize because there's so many cool things to photograph. Like, I primarily photograph people now, but I also photograph landscapes and travel for fun. And, it's just taking pictures is fun. But think about what it is that you want to take pictures of mostly. Then, what's your budget? How much money do you have to spend? $500, $1,000, $5,000, $10,000? Are you somebody where the sky's the limit? Fantastic, more power to you. Most of us aren't there. So it doesn't matter what the best camera in the world is if your budget doesn't allow for that. And that's totally fine. My first camera that was autofocus, I paid $300 used. My first digital camera, I paid $600 used. It just depends on what you need and how much you're going to use it and what your budget is. For some people, $500 is a drop in the bucket. For some people, $500 is a huge amount of money. My first apartment, my rent was $265. I made $500 was just an overwhelming amount of money to me at the time. Now I'll spend, I just bought an Alpha 1. That's not an inexpensive camera because it's what I need now. It serves the purpose I need. Everybody's different. Whatever your budget is what your budget is. You may decide to spend a little bit more, but bear that in mind. How important is size and weight? So you know what you want to photograph. You know what your budget is. Although, again, depending on what your budget is, that's going to limit your choices. But then, how much do you want to carry around? Do you want something like the RX02 that's, I've got one right here. It's itty bitty. It's got a fixed 35 or fixed 24 millimeter equivalent lens. You can drop it onto concrete from 5 feet or so. It won't break. You can take it underwater. It's a very robust little camera, but it's got a built-in lens and it's got limitations because of that. Something like the RX100 series, very portable, 1-inch sensor, small and light, but it's got the lens that's on there, and the 1-inch sensor is a smaller sensor than an APS-C, for example. You've got APS-C size cameras, so removable lenses, larger sensor than the RX0 and the RX100, not as large as full frame, but smaller and lighter. You've got your phone. We all have phones, I assume. It's always in our pocket. Maybe that's your answer. I think it's an answer, but not the only answer. Or you've got full frame. So do you want to carry the smallest, lightest thing possible? Do you want something in between? Are you going to be hiking for miles and miles and miles where one camera and one lens is all you want to carry? Are you going to be working out of a car where you can fill it up with 50 lenses? That's going to matter too. I hiked across the Grand Canyon a couple summers ago with one body and 3 lenses. And it was a lot to carry. It was worth it, but it was a lot to carry. All right, so I mentioned the sensor size a little bit, 1-inch APS-C full frame. Just to go over them a little bit more thoroughly, full frame is based on 35 millimeter film. It's roughly 24 by 36 millimeters. And it is pretty much it's the largest commonly available. There are some cameras that have larger sensors right now, I think about 2.5 times larger. But they tend to be slower, and they are much larger cameras typically. So full frame, Sony Alpha 1, A7 series. It's mostly what I use is full frame, but it's larger than APS-C. So APS-C is a little smaller. These sizes are all relative. And because it's smaller, the camera can be smaller. Then you have 1-inch, smaller still. 2/3 and 1/2.5 are what might be in a standard point and shoot, something not like the RX100, but like a $200 point and shoot, or in your phone. And as the sensor size gets smaller, all other things being equal, your image quality probably isn't quite as good. A larger sensor, better image quality, smaller sensor, not quite as good at image quality. That is, of course, a radical oversimplification. I've gotten great pictures with my 1-inch sensor cameras. And if the light is good, you can still get great pictures. You can't increase the ISO as much. So it's not that those aren't good. It's just larger is usually better. But you also have to balance it with what you need and what you want to carry. Then you've got camera types. You got a phone. Here's my Sony Xperia 5 Mark II. You got point and shoots. With point and shoots, you've got the cheap ones where you just turn it on and you push a button and you have really no control. And then you have things like the RX100 series where you can set it to RAW and you can put it in manual or aperture priority or shutter priority to shoot 4K video. there's a wide range in there. You've got bridge cameras like the RX10. We'll talk about that in a minute. Specialty cameras like the RX0, and then mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras, the A6000 line, the A7 line, the A9s, the Alpha 1s. There's a lot of options out there. To start with, you got your phone always in your pocket. Like I mentioned, I use the Xperia 5 Mark II. I love it. It actually has some features that are really great for photography. It has an app called Photo Pro, which will let you shoot in RAW or RAW plus JPEG. You can shoot in program or shutter priority. You can do exposure compensation, change the ISO, a ton of the options that are available on a bigger Sony Alpha camera. It is a smaller sensor, and it has a 16 millimeter, 24 millimeter, and 70 millimeter equivalent lens. If one of those works for you, that's great. It's a great tool. It's always in my pocket. That's great. It wouldn't be my only camera, but it's a great thing to always have with me. Then you've got point and shoot. So I mentioned the RX100 series. There are currently up to the RX107. I believe most of them are still available, just at progressively lower price points. So if the RX100 is still available, it's quite a bit cheaper than the 7, but there's trade-offs with everything, right? So the RX100 6 and 7, I have the 6, has a 24 to 200 millimeter equivalent lens built in. So in a little tiny camera, it's got a huge zoom. This is from the terrace, the roof of my building in Brooklyn that I live in. That's the same angle, 24 millimeter equivalent on the left, 200 millimeter equivalent on the right. Same angle, same shot. It's a huge difference in a little tiny camera. So the RX106 is also, well, it's not always in my pocket. It's always in my bag. Like usually when I'm walking around, I'm carrying a backpack. It's always in my backpack. If I need it, it's there. I'm not always carrying my Alpha 1 or my Alpha 7R4. Just they're bigger and bulkier, and it doesn't always make sense to carry them. And you'll also see that it says 9 millimeter and then 24 millimeter in parentheses, 72 and 200 in parentheses. With smaller cameras, 1-inch sensor cameras, phones, things like that, when it tells you a lens's focal length, it's typically in full frame equivalent. So the RX106 with its 1-inch sensor, it's really a 9 millimeter to 72 millimeter. It is the equivalent of a 24 to 200 on full frame. Most 1-inch sensor cameras, like I said, most point and shoots, most phones are using the 35 millimeter full frame equivalent. So just bear that in mind. APS-C, it's a little different, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Then you've got your bridge cameras, RX10 Mark IV, there's RX10 Mark III. The RX10 Mark IV has a 24 to 600 equivalent lens. The 3 has a 24 to 200 equivalent lens, I believe. For some people, this is the right camera. I was actually at B&H maybe 2 years ago, looking at the Sony stuff at the nice little Sony display up there on the camera floor, and I overheard a woman talking about going on an Alaska cruise, back when cruises were things you could go on, and trying to decide what camera to get. And she wanted to do, the big expanses of the glaciers and the ice coming off, but she also wanted to be able to photograph whales or animals. And so I suggested this camera to her because I can't keep my nose out of other people's business, apparently. I picked it up, had her zoom. If you're going on the trip of a lifetime, you want something small and compact, and you don't want to mess with a bunch of stuff, this could be the right camera. If, your parents are going on a safari and they're asking you what camera to buy, this might be the right camera for them. If you are going to really, really, really get into photography, it's probably not. If you're just looking, or it's probably not your only camera. It is a great camera. It can shoot 24 frames a second. It's got that huge zoom, but it doesn't have removable lenses, and it's a slightly smaller sensor. And you've got things like specialty cameras like the RX02, 1-inch sensor, fixed 24 millimeter lens, shockproof, drop-proof. You could take it snorkeling. I think you can go to about 30 meters, but do not quote me on that. You can get a waterproof housing to make it go deeper. It'll shoot 4K video. A lot of people, when I did the screenshot yesterday, it was back ordered. So if you want to buy it, looks like you've got to wait a couple of weeks. If you're shooting a lot of video and you need a crash camera, something that you're going to put on something that's going to bang into a wall and you don't want to destroy your more expensive camera, this might be the thing to do. You know, I've got mine right here. It's a really handy little camera, but it is a specialty camera. It's designed for certain uses and not a broad thing. Like if you want to photograph a million different things, probably not the camera for you, or at least not the only camera for you. I have a bunch of cameras because they all serve different purposes. Then you get into the classic mirrorless interchangeable lens camera. So the first digital cameras were all DSLRs, digital single lens reflex. So they had a mirror that flipped up. Sony about 8 years ago came out with the first APS-C mirrorless cameras where they removed the mirror. So there's no physical mirror anymore, which made the camera able to be a little bit smaller and lighter. And instead of looking through the viewfinder at a mirror, that's reflecting the stuff through the lens, you're seeing a live feed off of the sensor. Some of the benefits of that are that there are features that are available now that that you couldn't really do with a DSLR because of the way the system worked. One of the simplest and most obvious is when you're looking through a mirrorless camera, unless you turn this feature off, what you're seeing is what the picture is going to look like. You're seeing if the color is off. You're seeing if the exposure is off. You're seeing if something's too dark or too light. All of that, you're seeing your composition. All of that is because you're seeing what the sensor is seeing. So when you take a picture, it's pretty much what you just saw. That amount of control and that amount of being able to experiment and try things and just play is really fantastic. And there's features now like eye autofocus, animal eye autofocus, just the number of frames a second you can do because there isn't a mirror flipping up and down. And the mirror flipping up and down is another thing that could fail on a camera. Mirrorless is really incredible. I do remember speaking to someone who was asking me if what I thought about mirrorless before full frame was out, before it was really a thing. Did I think it could work for professionals? And at the time I was pretty skeptical. I was wrong. It's great. I truly think mirrorless is the future. Almost every camera manufacturer has basically said they're focusing on mirrorless. Sony has led the way for years. Obviously, I'm a Sony artisan and really believe in Sony. It's really fantastic. And functionally, it's pretty much will work for you the same way DSLR would. It's a camera, it's a box with a sensor in it with a lens that goes on. Same as a DSLR, there's just no mirror. And you've got a range. You've got the 6100, Alpha 7.2, 7C, 7R4. There's a lot more. There's the Alpha 1 that just came out. I just got mine on Friday. I'm very excited. Sony's flagship camera, really incredible. Can do up to 30 frames a second. All sorts of cool stuff. But $6,500, is it right for you? Maybe. If what you need to photograph is what that camera does well, and if you've got the money, it's an absolute fantastic camera, but maybe an APS-C 6100 is the right camera for you. That's part of the point of all this is you have to decide what makes sense to you. All right, so this chart, I'm not going to go over this whole chart. That sounds really boring. You may want to screenshot it if you care. I made this chart, so I apologize if there's any mistakes. But this chart has every Sony mirrorless camera that B&H has, sensor size, resolution, the max shooting speed, which is the number of frames per second it can shoot. So you've got something like the A7 II or the A7R2 that can do 5 frames a second. You have something like the A9 that can do 5 frames a second with a mechanical shutter or 20 frames a second with an electronic shutter. The Alpha 1 that can do 10 frames a second and 30 frames a second. There's a whole range. Most of the APS-C cameras can do 11 frames a second. All of that matters if you're shooting something that's moving quickly, animals, birds, sports. If you're photographing landscapes, the frames per second doesn't really matter. The battery, if it's the W50 or the Z100, the Z100 is a larger battery that will last a lot longer. What kind of video it will do? Will it do 4K? Will it do 4K 120, like the Alpha 1 or the Alpha 7 III, HD 240, whatever? Does it have pixel shift, which is a feature that only matters if you're maybe photographing still life or architecture or landscapes, where it physically moves the sensor and you can stitch them together to get a higher resolution picture. The maximum shutter speed, if it has in-body image stabilization, and then what the current price is as of yesterday, April 11th, 2021. That stuff changes all the time. If you care, screenshot this, or come back to it later. I'm not going to go over every detail, but it's just, if you're like, which camera do I want? There's a lot of information here. All right, so I really believe all the Sony mirrorless cameras are excellent cameras. They're all excellent. They serve different purposes for different people. I'm going to go over some of what I think you might want to look at for specific things. So, for example, if you photograph sports or anything that moves quickly, the Alpha 6000 series, so the 6100, the 6400, the 6600, good choices. They 11 frames a second. They're small. They're portable. If you want to move up a little, the Alpha 9 series, 20 frames a second, faster autofocus, more consistent autofocus, same resolution, or the Alpha 1 series, 30 frames a second, even yet still better autofocus, really, really fast camera. Those are what I would think about for sports. Could you use the A7 or the A7S or the A7R for sports? Of course you could. You absolutely could. I've shot people running and jumping and all sorts of stuff with my Alpha 7R4 and 3. You absolutely can. It's not that you can't use those cameras. It's that if you want to focus on sports, this is what I would look at. Portraits. I would say the Alpha 7 series, the Alpha 7R series, the Alpha 1 series. The reason I don't include the APS-C cameras is because with the smaller sensor, it's harder to get a shallow depth of field. And I like having a shallow depth of field with portraits because it allows me to separate my subject from the background. So I would prefer a larger sensor. The Alpha 7S series, lower resolution because it's very video heavy. It's very, very video centric. Excellent camera, does take amazing pictures. But for portraits, I would like something with a little more resolution. So the Alpha 7 series, the Alpha 7R series, which is what I have always used. And then the Alpha 1 series, which I now also have to supplement my Alpha 7R 4 and 3. For street, I think any of them can work. The A6000 series is great because it's small. And with street photography, sometimes you want to be small and inconspicuous. But any of them can work. The Alpha 7 series, the 7S series, 7R series, the Alpha 9 series, the Alpha 1 series, they're all good choices. Street photography covers so many different things and so many different use cases that I think any of them can work. The Alpha 7S series, for example, is really good with high ISOs. So if you're shooting somewhere that's dark, you're shooting in alleys, you're shooting at night, it could be the right choice, even though the resolution is less. For travel, again, the Alpha 6000 series, because it's small, 7, 7R, Alpha 1, all great choices. Architecture, again, I would stick with full frame, in part because wide-angle lenses aren't as wide effectively on APS-C because you're just using the middle of the sensor. And we will talk about why that is in a little bit. So if architecture is what you like to photograph, you're probably going to want to use wide-angle lenses. I think a full-frame series is a better choice for that. Animals, I would go with full frame again because it gives you more room to crop. But some people do like the A6000 series, so the 6100, 6400, 6600, or a used A6000 or 6300, because your lenses effectively become longer. A 200 on a 60-100 is roughly a 300 millimeter equivalent. So there's a benefit to that. The newer cameras, like the Alpha 7R, the Alpha 7 III, the A9, the A1, all have animal eye autofocus. So with most animals, not all, because nothing's perfect, if you turn that on, it will, and point it at, say, a bear, it will focus on that bear's eye. It will find that eye and focus on it. If there's stuff in the way, obviously it's an issue. The Alpha 1 series will also do that with birds. So if you're a big bird photographer, the Alpha 1 is the one you want. If you want to just photograph everything, I think the 7, the 7R, the Alpha 1 are all excellent choices. Again, all of these cameras would work absolutely fine. I think that these three cover a wider range of things well, but all of them are good cameras. For video, again, all of them will work, but I would not do the A7 II because it doesn't do 4K. But the Alpha 1 does 8K at 30p, and both the 7S and the Alpha 1 do 124K, which is great. So a really high frame rate for 4K. If you do video, those are the two I would look at. All right. So we quickly went through some cameras and some of the differences. Let's talk about lenses. For some people too, if you're on a limited budget, you might consider, if you've only got so much to spend, buying a better lens and a cheaper camera and then upgrading the camera later. Because new better cameras are coming out all the time. Your lens, a good lens on a cheaper camera is better than a cheaper lens on a more expensive camera. Because the lens can degrade the quality if it's not a good lens. A good lens on a cheap camera is still going to give you good results. Sony has different categories. So there's Sony G Master, which is their top of the line professional lenses. It's designed to be future-proofed so that it resolves a higher resolution. So as camera resolution goes up, you don't run into problems where the lens can't resolve that resolution. If, for example, you take a lens from 1995, put an adapter on it, put it on a modern camera, most of those lenses were designed for they were all designed for 35 millimeter film. Most of them, because that's all they were designed for, they were great for that, but they're not sharp enough to truly be excellent on modern digital cameras. They just weren't designed with that in mind because nobody knew. I mean, my A7R4 is 61 megapixels. That's a huge amount of resolution. It's much more than 35 millimeter film is. Nobody was thinking about that when they were designing lenses in the 80s or 90s. Sony G Master is designed so that when the next generation comes out, there's still excellent lenses. It's got better weather sealing, depth sealing, typically faster autofocus motors. Where the faster autofocus motors really matters if you're photographing sports. Let's say you buy the Alpha 1, you go out and photograph a football game, you put an inexpensive, cheap lens without fast motors on it, it can't do 30 frames a second because the motors in the lens can't keep up with the camera. If you Google it, if you're interested in that, Sony, there are lists that will tell you what lenses are capable of doing 20 frames a second and 30 frames a second. Most of the G Masters are. Some other lenses are as well, like the 20 millimeter 1.8G can do 30 frames a second, but some of the others can, some of them can't. So Sony G Master, top of the line. Sony G and Sony Zeiss, still excellent. Just sort of one step down. They're still really great lenses. There's Sony, for example, has a 70-200 f4G and a 70-200 f2.8G Master. I have the G because I like the slightly smaller body. Excellent lenses, still great. And then just Sony, still good lenses. It's just one tier down. So the glass isn't manufactured to the same tolerances. The weather sealing isn't as good. The autofocus motors aren't as fast. You pay more for better stuff. That's how it is. There's still excellent Sony lenses. The Sony 1.8, 85 millimeter 1.8, one of my favorite lenses, unbelievably sharp. It's just a Sony lens. Nothing wrong with them. It's just different levels of what you need. You're not going to photograph in storms. You don't need the weather sealing as much. Just depends. Then you have Sony E and FE. So all the Sony mirrorless cameras are E mounts. E, if it just says E, it's an APS-C lens. So it covers a smaller area. If it says FE, it's full frame E. F, full frame E. If you're just getting into photography and you're buying a 6400, I have one, great camera. One thing to think about when you're buying lenses are what your goals are in the future. If APS-C is what you love because you like it being smaller, it does everything you need, fantastic, then APS-C lenses are fine. If you think that at some point you might want to switch to full frame lenses will work just fine on APS-C. We'll cover that in a little bit. APS-C lenses will work on full frame, but not so well, and I'll show you why in a minute. So think about that. You're buying a 6100. Do you want to buy full frame lenses? They're going to be bigger and more expensive because there's more glass. The optics are different because it has to cover more area. But when you decide to buy a A7R4 or whatever, you can put it on. Or do you want to stick with APS-C because they're smaller and lighter and typically a little bit less expensive? I don't know. It's up to you. So we're going to go over APS-C versus full frame, focal length, zooms or primes. So focal lengths, 12 millimeters to 1200 millimeters. So currently with what Sony has available, the widest lens for full frame that you can get is 12 millimeters. So there's a 12 to 24 f4 and a 12-24 2.8 G Master. This is 12 millimeters from the rooftop of my building, 1200 millimeters. So that's a 200 to 600 with a Sony 2X teleextender. Like you can't even see where the Empire State Building is on that picture on the left, but it's there. If you see that sort of bump of buildings right in the middle, it's just to the left of that. Focal length covers a lot. Do you want long lenses? Do you want wide lenses? Well, obviously I have everything covered because I like to have options. But think about that for what you want to photograph. Do you love photographing landscapes? Wide angle is probably your answer. Do you love photographing animals? Long lenses are probably your answer. For portraits, it's somewhere in the middle. Then on APS-C, remember I mentioned that with APS-C, lenses become effectively longer. Wide angle isn't as wide. So 12 millimeters on APS-C is now the wide isn't quite as wide, but the 1200 is cropped in tighter. So just so you can see. Longer is longer, wider is also longer. And to give you an example of some things that you might want to use, this is 12-24 in Bryce Canyon at 12 millimeters, 100 to 400 at 400 millimeters on the Oregon coast, 24-70 G Master at 24 millimeters in LA from the Hollywood Hills, and at 70 millimeters. That's a big difference. So I mentioned small sensor crop factor. I mentioned the APS-C is effectively longer than full frame. It's millimeters is millimeters. It's a ratio. 12 millimeters is 12 millimeters. But what changes is the size of the sensor that it's projecting onto. An APS-C is like taking the middle of a full frame sensor and just removing the outside. With APS-C, it's roughly the millimeters times 1.5 is equal to the full frame millimeters equivalent. So 35 millimeter lens on an APS-C camera is about the same as a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame camera in terms of your field of view. It's actually, I think, 52.5 millimeters equivalent. So just so you understand that, to give you a sense, on full frame, 586 millimeters on the left, 400 millimeters on the right on APS-C, roughly the same size. 12 millimeters on the left, 1200 on the right, 12 millimeters on the left, 1200 on the right, APS-C on the bottom, full frame on the top. So you get a sense of the difference. It's also why with something like architecture, I recommend full frame. For some people, having that extra reach on APS-C is fantastic, and it's the answer. You could always, of course, crop your full frame, or with all the full frame Sony cameras, I believe, you can put it into APS-C mode, and it will just crop for you. But honestly, I would rather do that in post. And so here's something like this. Sony Alpha 6300 with a Sony 70 to 300 at 300 millimeters. Because it's on a 6300, I got more reach. I got roughly a 450 millimeter equivalent. If I'd done this picture with a full frame, it wouldn't have been as tight. I mentioned before, phones and point and shoot cameras use full frame equivalents usually. Just bear that in mind. And then APS-C versus full frame lenses. Full frame lenses on APS-C cameras works great. And some people would argue it's better because with some lenses, the center is the sharpest and you're removing the edges. APS-C lenses on full frame bodies, it works with caveats. So if you put a APS-C lens on a Sony camera that you haven't changed a menu setting, it will automatically crop to APS-C and you won't know that anything's different. It'll just be a narrower field of view and the raw file or the JPEG will be smaller. You can turn that off. So to get a sense of it, this is the Sony 10 to 18 APS-C lens at 18 millimeters on APS-C on the right, on full frame on the left, with the auto crop turned off. So you can see the vignetting in the corners. That's because the lens doesn't cover a full 35 millimeter full frame image area. At 18 millimeters, it almost does. It comes pretty close. You might be able to do some content aware fill and clean that up. At 10 millimeters, it's very pronounced. And different lenses have different amounts of vignetting. It's a question that people ask a lot is, can I use this lens on my full frame camera? Yes. Will I get some vignetting? Yes. How much? I don't know. To give another sense, the 16 to 50 APS-C lens at 50 millimeters, full frame on the left, APS-C on the right, that's a lot of vignetting. Like this feels like I'm looking at an old TV. Just a different lens. The 10 to 18 is known for having less vignetting. The 1650 has more. All right, moving right along. There's a lot to go through. Zooms or primes. So that is going from 1200 to 12. With a zoom, you can do that in 3 lenses. With primes, you'd have to do a whole bunch. That's the Sony 24-105 f4G on the top, one of my favorite lenses. To get the equivalent of that in fixed prime lenses, 24G master on the left, 28 f2, 35-1.8, 55-1.8, 85-1.8, 90 macro. You've mostly got that range covered in 6 lenses instead of 1. However, maybe those 6 lenses serve you better. I love that 24-105. It's one of my favorite lenses. It's actually on the camera that's pointed at me right now. But I also have all of these lenses because I love them too, and they serve different purposes. So zooms usually have a smaller maximum aperture. So the f-stop, like on my 24-105, the maximum aperture, so the largest it can be is f4. Primes are usually faster with a larger maximum aperture. So my, say, 24-1.4 G master, maximum aperture of 1.4, 1.4 to 2 to 2.8 to 4, it's 3 stops faster than the 24-105. So it lets in 3 times as much light, which means I could have a shutter speed that's 3 stops higher. So if I'm photographing and it's dark, it's going to serve me better. If I need to have a shallow depth of field, it's going to serve me better. So primes have benefits that zooms don't. Some zooms do go down to 2.8, but it's still 2 stops from my 1.4. And I have a 51.2 that's on order. That would be 2.5 stops. Primes are great. Zooms are also great. It just depends on what you need. Do you need the flexibility, or do you need a fast lens, or do you know that 85 is what you love and that's all that matters? There's also choices like 50mm lens. Sony has a lot of 50mm lenses. On the left, there's 2 APS-C lenses. I have a 51.8 because it's 50mm. But as we'll recall, on APS-C, that's equivalent to 75mm on full frame. So I also have a 35-1.8 there. Then there's 6 full frame Sony lenses. There's a 50-1.8, not to be confused with the APS-C 50-1.8, different lenses. 50mm 2.8, 50mm 2.8 macro, 55-1.8, 50mm 1.4, 50mm 1.2. I have the 55-1.8, and I am waiting. I think it comes out next month for the 51.2. They all serve different purposes. So the APS-C ones, they're smaller and lighter because they're APS-C. The 51.8 full frame, least expensive full frame on here, $248. It's the build quality isn't as high. The body's plastic instead of metal, but it's inexpensive. Does it matter to you? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. The 52.8 is smaller. It's designed, I think, primarily for the Alpha-7C, which is a very compact full frame camera. It's roughly the size of an APS-C camera, but with a full frame sensor. And they just came out with several lenses for it that are designed to be compact with that. But to make it small, the f-stop has to be 2.8. You can't make an itty bitty lens that's, say, 1.4 because you need more glass. The glass has to be larger to let in more light. 52.8 macro, you want to get nice and close. 55-1.8, love that lens. 51.4 Sony Zeiss, and a 51.2 Sony G Master that was just announced and is coming out next month. Which one is the right one? It just depends. They all, as I mentioned, they all have different uses. APS-C, maybe you want one of the APS-C ones. If you want 50mm equivalent, it's probably the 35. If you just want something inexpensive, 51.8. You want something small, 52.8. You want to be able to focus super close, photograph flowers or bugs. Maybe it's the macro. Want something with a little bit more build quality, metal body, fantastic lens, 55-1.8. You want a 1.4, you've got the Sony Zeiss. The Sony Zeiss and the G Master also have, oh, and actually the 52.8, all have physical aperture rings on the lens so that you can change it instead of using the dials on the body. If you shoot a lot of video, that might be really useful. You can also put it on A and use the dials on the body if you prefer. But there's different lenses for different reasons and at different price points. You spend more, you get more. You spend less, you get less. They're all good. And who you are and what you photograph needs to make that decision. All right. Then we have, you're starting out, try to decide what lens to get. You can only get one lens. My suggestion for everybody is a middle zoom. If you're only buying one lens and you're just starting out, a mid-range zoom will cover most things that you need, unless you're really photographing a specialty. But if you want to photograph everything, as most of us do, especially at the beginning, look at a mid-range zoom. So in APS-C, there's 4 choices: 16-70 Zeiss, 16-55. It's often a kit lens, comes with a lot of cameras. 16-50, or it's actually 16-50, 3.5-5.6. I wrote that wrong. 16-55, 2.8G, 18-105 f4G. Then you've got the 28-70. That's typically a kit lens. 24-70 f4 Sony Zeiss. 24-70 2.8 G Master. The 28-60 4-5.6. Again, that came out at the same time as the Alpha-7C. It's a little bit of a compacted zoom range to make it smaller. And then the 24-105 f4G. Again, so G Master, highest quality, best build quality, best weather sealing, best lens coatings, sharpest, best resolution. But what works for you is what works for you. You can see, the prices vary. I have the 16 to 50. I did at one point have the 24-70 Sony Zeiss. That was my first Sony mirrorless lens. But when the 24-70 G Master came out, I bought that one instead. And then I have the 24-105 f4G. You want something small and compact? You want something bigger and heavier? Something like the G Master, because it's a 2.8, is heavier and larger than something like the 28-70 3.5 to 5.6. What makes sense for you? All right. So much like I did with cameras, I'm going to quickly go over some suggestions for what I think you might want to think about if you're starting out and want to photograph specific things. For sports, I would look at a long zoom, 70 to 200 f4G, 70 to 200 2.8 G Master, the 100 to 400 4.5 to 5.6 G Master. For portraits, generally with portraits, you want a medium telephoto. So 24-105, 24-70, 80, one of the 85s, the 135. I have all of these except the 1.4 G Master. I love them all. Great lenses. The advantage of one of the zooms is you could do full length, you could do tight. It gives you a lot of flexibility. If you're photographing, let's say you want to get into actor headshots, one of the 85s or the 135 could be the choice. For street photography, I think a smaller lens, more compact, and a little bit wide. So a 35, maybe a 50, a 40. The 42.8 again is designed for the for the Alpha 7C. Those are what I would think about. You don't want a big lens for street photography. For travel, if you're just getting one, the 24-105 or the 24-70, you get the wide, the street market, the landscape, and then also you can photograph the cool food or maybe the bird. Architecture, you probably want to go wide. I would look at the 1635 2.8 G Master, the 1635 f4G, or it's actually not a Z, it's a 1635 f4 Sony Zeiss. My mistake. Every time I do these, I see things that no matter how many times I go through it. I would consider these. There are the 1224s, but the 1224s don't take screw-on filters, and you might need a polarizing filter or neutral density filter. The 1635s do. Animals, again, a longer lens. So same as for sports, but also you might look at the 200 to 600. Excellent lens. It's longer still. For a lot of sports, it might be longer than you need, just depending on what the sport is. But for animals, 600 is great. For events, a middle zoom, maybe a long zoom, depending on the event. But if you're doing something where you're going in and you're photographing, your cousin's birthday party or a corporate event, you're going to need to photograph those 5 people together when we're allowed to have events like that again. And then you might also need to photograph the person standing at the podium. A middle zoom is good, maybe a long zoom. If you want to photograph everything, those middle zooms again, like we talked about, the 2470, the 24-105 f4G, excellent lens. And for video, Sony has a 28-135 f4G lens that's designed for video. It's got a power zoom, so it's got a rocker switch that will automatically zoom in and out. You don't have to move the dial yourself. The 55, the 85, the 35, I think are all great for video, especially if you're on a gimbal, because you want something light and small. And then, of course, what about that lens that has been in the basement that your grandparents bought in 1943? Can you use that? Probably you can. Most lenses can be adapted to Sony cameras. There's a ton of adapters out there. Almost any lens that's ever been made, somebody makes an adapter for. As we mentioned before, some of that is not going to give you the same quality as a modern lens, but sometimes it's fun. Sometimes it's cool. I have some adapters for some old lenses from the 40s. I bought them. I played with them a little bit. I haven't used them since, but it's still cool. And if you're switching from another system, if you're If you've been photographing something forever and now you're thinking about switching to Sony, you can probably get an adapter for whatever you had. However, you are going to sacrifice potentially some autofocus speed. Bear that in mind. If you are switching from another system, what I usually tell people is if budget's an issue, whatever lens you use the most, buy that one, that version from Sony, and then over time, and then buy an adapter and over time upgrade your other lenses. And of course, the best camera and lens is different for everybody. As I said at the beginning, it might not even be Sony. It could be something else. I would encourage you to, figure out what you want, do some research. If it's possible to get your hands on one, see how it feels. The best camera in the world does you no good if you don't carry it around. If you have that amazing camera, but you don't like how it feels, or you don't like how heavy it is, or you don't like how it looks, or whatever, so you leave it at home or you leave it in a hotel room when you're traveling instead of using it, what's the point of having it? All right. Any questions?
All right, Tony, that was really thorough. Thank you. We do have some questions. Ismail asks, what do you think of used equipment? They say, I find great deals on APS-C lenses as people move to full frame.
I think there's nothing wrong with used equipment. Some of it depends on where you buy it and how you buy it. So, for example, B&H has a ton of used equipment. If you're buying it from B&H will back it up. So if you buy it and I don't know, do you know how long the return period is on used, Danny?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure.
There's some return period. So if you buy it and you take it home and a couple days later you realize it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, you can take it back to B&H and they'll take care of you. If you buy it from someone individually, that may or may not happen depending on who that person is. So just be careful with that. But I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with buying used stuff. Absolutely. It's totally fine.
Awesome. Okay. And Herman on live stream is asking, I have the Alpha 7 III and I love it. We came from Nikon and always had two bodies. What would you recommend as a second body?
So I would recommend another Alpha 7 III, but in part because then all the settings are the same, all the batteries are the same. It also depends on what you shoot, though. If you love the A7 III, but you wish you had more resolution, then it could be an R3 or an R4. If it's a backup that you don't think you're going to hardly ever use, and it's really just a backup in case everything goes to whatever, then maybe an APS-C. However, if you go with APS-C, the 6600 takes the same batteries as the 7 III, but the 6400, the 6100 don't. It's a different battery. And that can get complicated if you start having to have a bunch of the W batteries and a bunch of the Z batteries. The same thing, the A7 II, the Alpha 7 II that you can still buy is the older W battery, not the newer Z battery. So it's the same thing. I would bear that in mind. If it was me and the budget was there, I would just get another 7 III.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And Ismail also has another question. They say, what do you think about camera rigs or frames to bolt on accessories? The FX3 has all the mounting points, but small rig gives similar mounting points.
If you're shooting a lot of video, I think they're fantastic. If you're putting a bunch of stuff, if you're putting a monitor on there and all sorts of things, with the exception of the FX3, most cameras just aren't designed to have that much stuff on there. So I think a rig is great. Small rig is fine. I've used some small rig stuff. I've been happy with it.
Awesome. Julie has a question. She says, I have a Sony Alpha 7R4 and want to buy a Sony FE 24-105G lens. Is this good for all around use? Yes,
I think so. It is the lens that is on my camera the most. I love that lens. Like I said, it's on my camera right now. The white balance is changing because it's getting darker, but yeah, it's a great lens. I also have a podcast with where I talk to people who use Sony cameras, and I always ask what camera and lens people use, and the 24-105 is the lens that the most people say is their favorite lens.
Awesome. And we had a couple questions relating to macro photography. So Elmo asks, what is an ideal macro lens for nature photography?
So I really like the 90 macro There's also the 50 macro. And I think there's a 35 macro for APS-C. The 90 macro is one of the sharpest lenses out there. It's unbelievably sharp. And I think a 90 gets you a little more distance than a 50. You're right on top of things. So if you're photographing something that you don't want to disturb, I think a 90 is going to give you a little more flexibility. It's a great lens.
Awesome. And then Herman asks, would you recommend the 50 millimeter 2.8 with the APS-C turned on in camera as a macro option?
No, I would just zoom if you're going to do that. I mean, I would just crop and post if you're going to do that. You're not gaining anything by cropping in camera that you wouldn't gain by just cropping later. There is clear image zoom, which you can use with JPEG, that is a little bit better than cropping in camera, but it doesn't work with RAW. And I have the 90 macro right here. See, that's how much I love the 90 macro. It's right next to me.
And then Madeline also has a question about macro. She says, which camera and lenses would you recommend for macro botanical photography?
So 90 macro again. And I would go with resolution. So I'd go with the Alpha 7 R4 or the R3 to get, or the Alpha 1. But if the R4 has the highest resolution, and I think with that kind of work, you want as much resolution as possible. So I'd go with the 90 macro and the R4.
Awesome. And Judith has another recommendation question. So what would you recommend as a step up from an Alpha 6000 if weight is a consideration? She says she's doing mostly street and fine art photography.
So I would look at the Alpha 7C, which is a full frame that is only a tiny bit larger than APS-C. But you are going to still have full frame lenses, which are larger. So I would look at that. If that doesn't make sense because you don't want the larger lenses, I would look at the 6400, which is APS-C. It's a great camera, 4K video. It's got more features than the 6100 does, which is the replacement for your 6000. So it's one step up from that. I would look at that.
Awesome. And regarding what we were speaking about before with the shutter count, Elisa asks, how do you know how much the shutter was used?
So there are third-party apps. I can't remember any of them that you could download. And what you do is you download it, you open up a picture taken with the camera, and it will tell you the shutter count because it's in the EXIF data. It's just not the EXIF data that most software can read. So you need a picture that was just taken with it. Like point it at your wall, take a picture, drag it in and look. You don't want necessarily, if someone's unscrupulous, they could send you a picture they took 2 years ago with it. So then the shutter count says, 8 when it's really 80,000. But it's pretty easy. If you just Google whatever camera model it is, so let's say Alpha 7 R4 shutter count app, you should be able to come up with something. I don't remember any of them because I haven't looked in years. I haven't bought a used camera in a long time, so I haven't really paid attention. But there's a bunch of stuff out there. Most of it's free.
Awesome. And then Elisa also asks, given a limited budget and interest in nature, close-up, landscape, and event photography, would you recommend a zoom or a prime?
Zoom. The zoom, that mid-range zoom is going to give you a lot more flexibility. Whereas a prime, while they're great lenses, if you're only going to get one lens, I think you're better off with a mid-range zoom because you're going to be able to get the wide, you're going to be able to get the tight, especially for event photography. You may not be able to back up quickly enough with a prime to get everything you need or move forward quickly enough to get closer, where with a zoom, you could just zoom in and out.
Okay, awesome. Well, Tony, that was awesome. It looks like we covered everything that came in. So thank you so much for joining us today. That was really insightful and really thorough.
My pleasure. And people are, as always, welcome to reach out if you have more questions. If I don't get back to you, just reach out again. If I get busy, I get just, if a client calls, I answer that email first.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you, Tony, again. Thank you to Sony, of course, for sponsoring. And thank you to all you guys for watching. We'll see you next time at the B&H Virtual Event Space.
Thanks, everybody.